Okay, here we go. Kinesiology 230, chapter 15. This is presentation number 2. This is still kind of in the introductory portion of the chapter, where they're going to outline a few different things regarding strength training and fitness. There's some concepts that are there about periodization and general adaptation syndrome. So I think without further ado, given the number of presentations that we have, I think we got to jump on in. So we already talked about this in terms of what's going on in chapter 15, so I'm not going to belabor the points here. But when we get into this, we're really talking about these 4 main principles that are within the context of resistance training. You have specificity. It has to be specific to the outcome that you want, or specific to a sport that you're training for. There has to be overload to tax the system enough where you elicit a training response. There needs to be variation in the programming between different variables, which could be barbells to kettlebells, and there needs to be progression. So like in the spreadsheet to the right, if you look at different breakdowns of sets of 10 to 8 to 5 to 4 percentage basis, you have to be able to have a progressive overload in the process to be able to systematically overload the human organism or the muscles within the body itself to elicit the training responses that you want. So it kind of gets back to, and really the foundation of this is specificity. And what we'll find is when we go look at this, you're trying to use a specific training method to elicit a specific training response. Now, for many of your clients, it's going to be, I want to lose weight, I want to get in shape, and it's going to be very basic. But if somebody comes in and they say they want to be a power lifter, all bets are off because now your programming has to change to meet that. Or if somebody comes in, they're telling you that they want to be the top runner in the 5K run for their office party, you got to change the programming to match that. And usually when you work with folks from the general population, it's a broad brush to paint with. I mean, you could throw anything at them in terms of medicine balls, kettlebells, weights, dumbbells. It's a broad brush because you have so many different things you can do with them because you're not limited by a sport-specific adaptation response that you're looking for. But when an athlete comes in or somebody with a very specific need, then it changes, right? Because then you have to go ahead and look at it in terms of you have to train for the overall athleticism, you have to train for the sport, train for the position, and train for the individual athlete itself. It's kind of an ascending pyramid, which I'll talk a little bit about in another presentation. But the point is, you look at this specificity that you have, and the specificity itself comes from you target specific movement patterns, right? And it could be targeting specific muscle groups. I need to get bigger biceps, got to get swole when I go to the beach. You can say I'm going to target, specific muscles. In terms of working specific muscles like your biceps. I jumped ahead there. And then you can target specific energy systems. So you're going to stay specifically in the phosphagen system or the aerobic system. And I can tell you as a trainer, once you start to master those 3 main energy systems, if you want to subdivide the glycolytic one into fast and slow glycolytic, you can have some fun in terms of working with your athletes, and they won't even know what the heck's going on, but you're utilizing these different energy systems for both work and recovery. And it's a pretty solid combination. It really allows you to have great programming with your clients. So with overload, we're looking at the training stress or intensity that is applied to the human organism. And the stressor itself, for it to elicit a training response, has to be greater than what the client is accustomed to. If your client is accustomed to doing 2 sets of 10 on every piece of equipment in the gym, our bodies are really good at adapting, but they're only going to adapt so far, and they're going to adapt to the point, and that's kind of like this homeostasis, laziness, if you will. And you have to change the training stimulus, whether it's 3 sets of 10 or 4 sets of 10 or 4 sets of 8 or 3 sets of 6, whatever that may be. And we've talked a little bit about rep and set schemes in brief in this class. But what you're looking for in terms of overload is you're either performing the exercise with more weight, or you're performing more repetitions while doing the exercise. And you can have combinations therein, and you can mix and match your rep and set schemes to be able to accomplish these goals. And you can play around with the recovery that is seen in between sets. If you're talking like 3 sets of 10 with 10 seconds rest in between, it's really one big 30-second or one big 30-rep set, which I've talked about before. You're playing around with that lactic acid component in terms of letting the body recover fully. But the recovery itself can be seen when in between sets, but also when you look at the increase in number of weekly training sessions, what you're actually inferring there is also the recovery that's seen in between workouts. Now, granted, if you do legs on a Monday, chest on a Tuesday, and you do arms on a Wednesday and back on a Thursday, you're not training the same muscle groups per se every day, but you are taxing the human organism, and the human body itself will have this kind of cumulative effect of the stressors that are placed upon it. So you have to be able to program in strategically rest and recovery time in between each of your sessions. I'm just going to go back to this. And even within the recovery component, you can do things to facilitate recovery, whether it's massage therapy, cold plunge, as well as warm plunge if you want to go ahead and go that route. You can use those things to help you recover faster. And one of the great things that you can do for rest, regen, recover, and recuperation is just rest. And that's the other R and the 4R there. So if we go into variation, now with variation, you're trying to manipulate specific training variables, whether it's the volume, the intensity. I'm like sitting on a kettlebell down here. Put myself right in the middle. The volume, the intensity, the exercise selection, frequency, the rest interval, which we've talked a little bit about, and the speed of movement. And periodization is the logical phasic manipulation of training factors to optimize specific training outcomes at specific time points. And that's right from the book. And I can tell you from years ago, it was a little different in terms of what periodization was, how it was referred, and I'll get to that in a second. Now, progression, it's the process of altering training stress as a client adapts, and this is termed as progressive overload. So as you're working with your clients, you're adding stress, reducing stress, manipulating the variables to be able to increase the different levels of stress, but also types of stress that the person is experiencing. And you have to remember, from a general adaptation syndrome standpoint, we're always trying to apply a training stressor to the human organism to get a training response. And the training stress needs to be appropriate for the person, and it has to be manipulated within the context of a specific training goal that we're trying to accomplish. With periodization, it was once defined as a scientific manipulation of training stimulus to elicit a desired training response, to increase that training response, if you will, and reduce the likelihood of injury to the participant. I'm not sure where that transitioned or changed over the last couple of years, but it has changed. If I remember clearly, it was this. And I like them both. I like the older version. I like the new version as well. But I think you have to look at it in terms of you're trying to increase the training response, but you're also trying to have a scenario where you're applying just right, the Goldilocks amount of stimulus to be able to get the training response, but not so much where you overtax a person and take them into an overtrained state. Let's go back to the general adaptation syndrome. We're applying the stimulus, and if it's too much, the person becomes overtrained. If it's too little, you'll have a little bit of a training response, but there will be no long-term training response because you just won't have that progressive overload. If you have the same stimulus, the participant will plateau, and same thing, they'll kind of go into this monotonous program overtraining, which is a terminology that's used in the book, and I think you see elsewhere. So I just want to point out that, you have to kind of wrap yourself in the context of it's a training stimulus we're applying to the human organism to get a training response. And sometimes that training response is very specific, like you want to be a better outfielder, or that specific response is very much in the context of just being able to get up a flight of stairs with my groceries to get to my apartment. So you could have different ends of the spectrum on that depending who's in front of you as a client. So make sure you listen to your clients, listen to what their needs are, understand what their limitations are, and then you have a better understanding of what stressor you can apply to the human organism to get the response that you want and that your client needs. All right, guys, moving on.